The air was thin and cruel that morning, carving frost into the edges of every rivet. Above the clouds, the sunlight was blinding white, too pure for the world it revealed. Contrails stretched across the German sky in long silver scars coming from the west, endless, shimmering, and wrong. Oberleutnant Hans Keller blinked against the glare through his canopy-gloved fingers, tight on the throttle of his Focke-Wulf 190A8. At 30,000 feet, oxygen hissed like a whisper between breaths, while Berlin lay beneath him, a gray mirage in the haze. A year earlier, this view had meant triumph, unescorted bombers dragging their silver carcasses across the Reich's heart. The Luftwaffe's hunters once owned these skies, turning mathematics into ritual 900-kilometer closure. 800-meter bursts, 10-second passes, then dive away. Precision, repetition, arrogance. The bombers had always turned back. They always had. But today, something was off. Reports came through unidentified fighters still accompanying the formation. Impossible escorts never crossed the Rhine. That was the rule. Yet above the bombers, small gleaming specks held formation steady and calm. Not thunderbolts. Not lightnings. Slender, long-nosed falcons gleaming with a strange purpose. The radio crackled, possibly new American fighter. Still inbound. Still with bombers. That single word still felt like a wound. Still after Münster. Still after Hanover. Still over Berlin. Keller trusted his eyes, not his disbelief. He sealed the canopy, pushed the throttle forward, and dove. The Focke-Wulf trembled as it sliced the thin air bomber columns, swelling ahead like silver rivers 3,000 meters thick and 50 planes across. He rolled inverted nose down cannons, armed, the hunter's confidence returning until the sky erupted. Tracers cut past his canopy, bright, deliberate, not from bombers but from the flank. He jerked hard right, breath hammering, and saw it, a sleek silver shadow on his tail, faster, smoother, impossibly close. His wingman's voice cracked through the static. Hans sei bleiben, sie drehen nicht They're staying, they're not turning back. Keller pulled up, crushed by G-force, but the pursuer matched every move. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The Luftwaffe had always chosen the terms of battle. Now the enemy dictated them over Germany's own sky. The new fighter, the P-51, was rewriting every law they had lived by. At 30 yards, Keller glimpsed it fully, the red spinner-polished fuselage, mirrored canopy. For an instant, two pilots locked eyes, arrogance meeting revelation. Keller fired reflexively, tracers arcing wide. The Mustang rolled away, looping back like a ghost, refusing to vanish. He dove through clouds and broke out into chaos. Berlin burned below factories and rail yards, erupting as hundreds of bombs fell in waves. Radios screamed B-17s over the capital. Escorts still overhead, we can't get through, fuel, critical, returning to base. The sky was filled with white scars and fire. Keller leveled off at 10,000 feet, fuel nearly gone. The contrails above, still unbroken, stretching westward, like veins of inevitability. On the ground, Berliners stared upward at what they'd been told could never happen. Daylight bombers directly above their city, guarded by fighters that refused to turn back. The sirens came too late. The illusion of safety was gone. When Keller landed on fumes at Wittenberg, the laughter in the mess hall had vanished. Someone finally whispered what everyone already knew: wenn sie Berlin erreichen können sie überall hin. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. The sentence spread faster than any order, faster than any hope, across every airbase into Göring's office itself. The realization was simple and devastating. The Americans had erased distance. That same evening, far to the west, Captain James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group climbed from his Mustang in East Anglia, its belly streaked with oil and victory. His ground crew surrounded him, laughing, counting bullet holes. He pulled off his mask and said the only words that mattered: we made it to Berlin and back. Silence fell, then cheers. What had been fantasy that morning was now history. 69 bombers down, hundreds damaged, but the escorts had done the impossible. The price was heavy, but the math had changed. For the first time, survival was possible. In Berlin, Keller lay awake, hearing the hiss of oxygen in his memory, once the breath of the hunter, now the whisper of inevitability. He knew they would return tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until the sky no longer belonged to them. Above the burning capital, the contrails turned red in the dying sun, words written across the heavens, the kind that could never be erased. It was a strange kind of confidence that filled the Luftwaffe's ready rooms in 1943. The walls were yellowed with smoke maps covered in red lines drawn and redrawn until even the paper looked tired. Yet the men staring at them believed with absolute faith in one thing: control. To them, air combat was geometry, not chaos. Altitude, angle, and timing were the only truths that mattered. Their rhythm was perfect: climb to 26,000 feet, roll from the sun, fire, vanish. The Americans' fighters could never follow. Their fuel limits were the Reich's shield. They called it der Schild des Himmels, the shield of the sky. As long as escorts turned back at the Rhine, Germany was untouchable. They will die before they see Berlin, Major Bülogen promised, chalking circles on the map. The Luftwaffe's doctrine was clean, confident, and blind. Across the channel, engineers at North American Aviation were quietly building the weapon that would shatter that illusion. The P-51 Mustang, powered by a British Merlin engine, was a new kind of machine, faster, higher, and far more efficient. With paper drop tanks bolted under its wings, it could fly 6 hours, cross the Rhine, reach Berlin, and return. Mechanics joked it was held together by glue and prayer, but the math was real. The invisible wall the Germans worshipped had just been erased. They didn't know it yet. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, the Luftwaffe's confidence peaked, even as its strength bled away fuel shortages, raw recruits, training accidents. Still, every morning at Wittenberg, Keller and his squadron drank coffee, laughed about American suicide missions, and trusted the same old playbook. Until the reports came, escorts still with bombers over Hanover, over Magdeburg, over the Elbe. By 0900 hours, radar screens across northern Germany showed the impossible fighter blips flying with the bombers all the way to Berlin. "They are above the city," shouted one controller. "Impossible," a colonel barked, slamming the table. But arithmetic doesn't care about pride. 108-gallon drop tanks, efficient engines, and discipline had done what arrogance said could not be done. Across the channel, the 357th Fighter Group called it simply the Big One. Hours later, their contrails crossed Germany's heart. Captain Bud Anderson wrote in his report, "Saw Berlin for the first time today. Saw the enemy run for the first time, too." The Luftwaffe's geometry no longer worked. Its rhythm was broken. Every extra mile the Mustangs could fly meant fewer seconds to intercept, fewer victories, more defeats. A few officers understood what had happened, but doctrine dies slower than men. In Keller's hangar, pilots still painted victory marks, still dreamed of duels, but the age of duels was over. The sky had become a system of range, fuel, and endurance, and the system no longer belonged to them. After that day, the shield of the sky was gone. The war in the air had changed forever, from arrogance to endurance, from certainty to survival. It was 1943, and the ready rooms of the Luftwaffe smelled of cigarette smoke and certainty. Maps plastered the walls, red lines layered, until the paper itself looked worn from triumph. Each line marked another interception, another success, another reason to believe they owned the sky. To them, air combat was geometry, altitude, speed, timing, a clean, elegant science of minutes, not hours. Climb to 26,000 feet, roll from the sun, fire, once vanished. That ritual drilled in every Staffel from the Channel coast to the Ruhr had become doctrine and comfort. They named it der Schild des Himmels, the shield of the sky, and trusted its invisible boundary of fuel and range as absolute. The P-47 was powerful but thirsty, the P-38 graceful but temperamental in thin air. As long as escorts turned back before the Rhine, Berlin, and the Reich's heart remained safe. Doubt was dangerous. Laughter and maps were easier. Even whispers of a new long-range escort were swatted away by bravado. Goering mocked it. Officers joined in, and the rumor died beneath coffee and jokes. The very efficiency that had made the Luftwaffe formidable had calcified into blindness. Across the channel, however, engineers and pilots were solving a different equation: endurance. In cold hangars at North American and Packard's plants, under humming lights stained with oil and coffee blueprints, and late nights produced a quiet revolution, the P-51 Mustang with its Rolls-Royce Merlin heart. On paper, it was modest. In practice, with two 108-gallon drop tanks bolted under its wings, it became a machine that could fly 6 hours, cross the Rhine, reach Berlin, and return. The tanks were crude cardboard laminated with resin, prone to leak or burst, and mechanics joked the thing was held together by hope. Yet the arithmetic was undeniable: range doubled, the Reich's invisible wall was breached, and what had once been a rule of survival became meaningless. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's material situation worsened. Fuel depots and rail yards were being hammered. Replacements with barely 50 hours of training filled cockpits. Accidents climbed. Yet doctrine did not bend. Intercept, destroy, return. The rituals continued at airfields from Brunswick to Wittenberg, where men sipped dented tin coffee and mocked the idea that daylight raids could reach Berlin. Then the radar blips came. Controllers in Bremen and Magdeburg stared at screens that should have gone blank well west of the Elbe, but the echoes stayed small, sharp, steady. Visual confirmations followed. The unthinkable became undeniable. When the Mustangs crossed the Elbe and contrails arced over the Reich's heart, the Luftwaffe's equations unraveled. In command, bunkers beneath Berlin, radios screamed as pilots and officers watched the old geometry collapse. Intercept windows widened into vulnerability. Climb profiles left fighters exhausted and low, and fuel that had once been a shield now counted the minutes of doom. Arithmetic engine efficiency, drop tanks discipline, had replaced miracles. On the English airfields, pilots strapped in under pale dawn's briefings marked a straight red line from Leiston to Berlin, and back, and hours later, those lines were white scars across German skies. Reports filtered through escorts still with them, above the city. Officers read the facts and understood the implication without voicing it aloud. The shield of the sky had cracked. Where laughter once ruled, a colder feeling took hold, fear, the first tangible hint of defeat. Doctrine, like pride, dies slowly and usually at altitude. For the Luftwaffe, the death began not with a single shot, but with endurance, an enemy that had learned how to stay. Dawn broke like cold metal over East Anglia. The fog rolled low across the airfields, thick and heavy, clinging to the bombers parked wingtip to wingtip. Crew chiefs moved through it like ghosts, shouting clipped words into the morning air, their voices swallowed by the hum of engines warming up. Inside the ready hut, pilots hunched over enamel mugs of coffee, eyes fixed on the map, where a single word written in red chalk glared back at them: Berlin. The silence in the room was thick. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Then the operations officer tapped the map with his pointer, the wood clacking against the board like a starter's pistol. Primary objective: railway yards and aircraft factories, central Berlin. Escort from takeoff to target and return. He paused, letting the last word hang. Yes, gentlemen, return. Outside, the frost cracked under boots. The first bombers taxied into position, engines coughing, belching white smoke. The air trembled as hundreds of Wright cyclones came alive, a low thunder rolling across the English countryside. Over that sound rose a sharper tone, the sleek growl of Packard Merlin engines as P-51 Mustangs spun up their props. Crewmen slapped metal fuselages for luck. Someone whistled, "We'll meet again," and it vanished in the wind. Captain James Goodson climbed into his Mustang, its nose painted red, the word Blondie stenciled below the canopy. He checked his oxygen feed, adjusted the gun sight, and murmured into the mic, "Berlin, hell of a place for breakfast." At 07:45, the first formation lifted into the gray sky, wheels tucking beneath silver wings. More followed, wave after wave, until the sky above East Anglia shimmered with aluminum, a moving city of flying fortresses. Beneath them, the Mustangs formed a living guard, sliding into escort position in pairs. The channel crossed beneath them without a word. Radio discipline was absolute. Every pilot could feel the weight of what this mission meant. Somewhere below, the coast of France passed under their wings. Ahead lay 500 miles of enemy airspace, the most dangerous stretch of sky in the world. Far to the east, in a cold control bunker near Bremen. German radar operators saw the swarm first. Green blips crawled across the screen, hundreds, then thousands. The controllers muttered in disbelief. The range was wrong, the altitude impossible. "They can't still have escort," one said. but the echoes stayed tight and steady, moving toward Berlin like a storm front. Scramble all Gruppen came the order. Sirens screamed across airfields from Brunswick to Wittenberg. Mechanics ran for cover as Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts roared to life. Oberleutnant Hans Keller sprinted across the tarmac, frost biting through his boots. He climbed into the cockpit of his FW-190, the seatbelt frozen stiff. His hands trembled, though, from cold or fear he couldn't tell. The ground crew pulled away the chocks. The plane lurched forward, engine howling. Over the radio came a flood of voices. Angels 25. Intercept over Magdeburg. Keller jammed the throttle open and climbed into the glare. The city fell away beneath him, its smokestacks blurred in the morning haze. Above 20,000 feet, the sky turned white-blue, painfully bright. He spotted them first, as glints on the horizon, hundreds of B-17s, sunlight flickering off their wings. The sight was familiar, comforting even. They'd done this dance 100 times before. Climb above, dive, head on fire. The 20mm cannons break away, repeat. 10 seconds of exposure, then home. Simple math perfected over years. But today the numbers felt wrong. As he closed the gap, something new appeared, smaller shapes, faster moving with the bombers keeping formation. For a moment his brain refused to process what he saw. Control confirm escorts. Are those thunderbolts? The answer came with a tremor. Negative. New type. Still with the bombers. The phrase "still with the bombers" hit like ice water. Keller squinted. Sleek silhouettes gleamed in the sun, long nose bubble canopy wings, narrow and deadly. P-51s. Dozens of them. They weren't turning back. They were coming all the way. He felt the first burst of panic as he rolled into position. They can't stay this far. It's impossible. But impossibility was already above him. The Mustangs broke formation, splitting into attack pairs, diving from the sun. The sky turned violent. Tracer fire ripped through the thin air, white streaks snapping past his canopy. Keller banked hard left. A Mustang followed, smooth and relentless. He caught a flash of the American pilot's eyes, calm, focused, utterly unafraid. Keller pulled up wings, groaning. The Mustang stayed with him, matching every move, engine note steady like a heartbeat. Down below, the bomber stream droned forward, unwavering. Inside one of the B-17s, the gunner of Little Rebel swung his turret and shouted, "Fighters! Our fighters! Jesus, they're still with us!" For the first time in 2 years, American bombers flying over Berlin had company. The formation released its payloads in a rolling wave. The city below erupted. Fire leapt from the railway yards, the Siemens factory, the assembly lines that once fed the Luftwaffe. Columns of smoke rose to 20,000 feet. Even from above, the destruction looked biblical. Keller's instruments screamed fuel low. He dove through a layer of flak bursts, black puffs thundering around him. His radio was chaos. "We can't reach them too high," another pilot yelled. "They're everywhere, return to base," someone barked. But no one wanted to be the first to turn. Pride kept them fighting long after reason was gone. Goodson, high above, saw a flash of movement. He banked, sighted, and squeezed the trigger. His Mustang's 650 caliber guns roared, a stream of lead slicing through the sky. The German fighter burst into flames and spiraled down a streak of orange against the gray. He didn't cheer. There was no triumph left in killing men who had no choice but to fight. Below, Berlin burned. Civilians ran through the streets as debris rained from the sky. Firefighters shouted through the roar of collapsing roofs. For years, the city had watched distant smoke rising from other towns. Now the smoke was its own. By the time Keller broke free of combat, his fuel light was blinking red. He turned west, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the contrails stretching toward the horizon. The bombers were heading home, their escorts still circling above them like silent guardians. "They made it," he whispered, voice cracking. "All the way." When he landed at Wittenberg, his tank was dry. The mechanics helped him out of the cockpit, their faces blank. Around them, engines cooled in the cold air, ticking like dying clocks. Out of 16 aircraft, only 9 returned. He looked up. The contrails that had once been his hunting ground now cut across the sky like scars. In the operations bunker that night, the reports were grim. Losses, heavy morale shaken, the impossible confirmed. Enemy fighter Escort remained over target area, one officer read aloud, his voice flat. Goering said nothing. Outside, snow drifted through the floodlights, melting against the wings of grounded fighters that would never rise again. Across the channel, at a muddy airfield in England, Goodson stood beside his Mustang as the sun set behind him. The plane was riddled with bullet holes, its paint scorched, but it had brought him back. His crew ran toward him, shouting. Someone asked Berlin. He nodded, too tired to smile. "Berlin," he said, and back. Somewhere over the North Sea, the last straggling B-17 limped home on one engine, flanked by two Mustangs flying on fumes. They touched down in darkness, engines coughing to silence. No one spoke. Every man there knew what it meant. The unthinkable had been done. And far behind them, above a city still burning, the fading contrails glowed red in the sunset. They stretched across the sky like writing on parchment, a single unbroken message: no more sanctuaries. Dawn crept across East Anglia like the slow opening of a steel shutter, cold light spilling over endless rows of bombers, parked wingtip to wingtip. The airfields shivered with noise, the cough of engines, the rattle of tools, the shouted orders of ground crews who had long since forgotten what silence sounded like. Inside the briefing hut, the men sat hunched under yellow light, as the operations officer pointed his stick at a red line stretching deep into the heart of Europe. Primary target, Berlin. For a moment, no one moved. The word felt heavier than the room itself. Then the officer added almost softly, "Escort from takeoff to target and return." That word return hung in the air. Outside, frost steamed off the wings as the first engines turned. At 07:45, the sky filled with thunder. 700 bombers rose from English soil, climbing into a pale sun, their vapor trails weaving across the sky. Beneath them, the new P-51 Mustangs slid into formation, like silver blades drawn from a single sheath. Each man at the stick knew this mission would decide more than a city's fate. It would decide whether the promise of range was myth or miracle. Far to the east, in a concrete bunker near Bremen, the early warning operators were already shouting over the hum of machines. On the radar screen, green dots bloomed and multiplied, hundreds of them, then more. One officer frowned. "They're too high, too far east." "Where are their escorts?" another replied uncertainly. "Still with them, sir." The room went quiet. "Still with them," he repeated. Escorts never stayed past the Rhine. It was a law of the war, as unbreakable as gravity. Yet the screen insisted. The bombers were moving toward Berlin, and the smaller points, the escorts, were not turning back. Minutes later, airfields across northern Germany came alive with sirens. Pilots sprinted through frost engines, screamed, and the Luftwaffe took to the sky. At Wittenberg, Oberleutnant Hans Keller yanked his FW-190 into motion, the world narrowing to engine noise and ice glare. Over the radio came the familiar rhythm altitude calls, intercept vectors, attack orders, and yet something in his gut felt wrong. He leveled out at 25,000 feet and saw them, a silver river of bombers stretching to the horizon, sunlight flickering along their bellies. And then he saw what should not have been there. Smaller, faster shapes flying tight alongside them, flashing like knives in the light. "Control confirm, are those thunderbolts?" Keller called. Static. Then a voice he didn't recognize, negative. Type unknown. Still with the bombers. He squinted, heart thudding. Long noses, slim wings, red spinners, P-51s, the new machines that rumor had promised, but no one believed. His stomach tightened. "They're still here," he whispered, almost to himself. Before he could think, the sky burst open. Tracers hissed past his canopy, slicing through the cold air. He rolled hard left. A Mustang followed, smooth, merciless. Keller pulled vertical, his vision dimming at the edges as the G-forces crushed him. The American pilot stayed with him all the way up, turning his climb into a trap. For a fleeting second, Keller saw his enemy's face through the canopy, calm, masked eyes, steady, and understood that this was not the war he had trained for. Below, the bomber stream droned forward, their bomb bays yawning open. A heartbeat later, Berlin erupted. Fire leapt from the railway yards, the Siemens plant, the factories that had fed Germany's war machine. From 30,000 feet, Keller could see entire districts flickering like dying coals. The city that was supposed to be untouchable was now burning in daylight. The radio dissolved into chaos. "Too many. We can't reach the bombers," someone screamed. "Fuel critical, disengage," another shouted. Keller's gauges were already sliding toward empty. He rolled away, diving through clouds lit by muzzle flashes. Above him, the Mustangs circled like falcons, never breaking formation, never turning home. For the first time, he felt hunted inside his own sky. Below, civilians ran through the streets of Berlin as sirens wailed over the roar of explosions. The air smelled of burning oil and stone dust. From a shattered rooftop, a boy looked up and saw silver dots moving across the sun. He thought they were angels until one of them dropped a bomb that split the air with light. In that instant, the myth of invulnerability died not with a speech or surrender, but with the sound of glass falling in the capital of the Reich. When Keller finally landed, the fuel light had been blinking for 5 minutes. He sat in the cockpit long after the engine shut down, the propeller spinning to a slow stop. The mechanic climbed up to the wing, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Half the squadron was gone. Smoke from the city still smudged the western sky. In the command bunker, the after-action reports came in one after another. Heavy losses, scattered formations, complete failure to repel. "Enemy fighter escort remained over target area," one officer read aloud. No one spoke. They all understood what those words meant. The shield of the sky was broken. Across the channel at a muddy airfield in England, Captain Goodson stepped down from his Mustang. Its paint scorched, its wings dotted with holes. "Berlin?" a mechanic asked. Goodson nodded once, and back. The men cheered, but the sound felt small against the enormity of what had happened. Over Germany, contrails glowed red in the setting sun, stretching across the heavens like fresh scars. The message written in vapor was one no empire could erase: there are no more sanctuaries. The laughter that had once filled Luftwaffe ready rooms died quietly in the spring of 1944. What replaced it was the sound of boots echoing through half-empty hangars and the smell of fuel that never arrived. The Americans came back to Berlin, then to Leipzig, to Frankfurt, to Munich, each raid escorted all the way by those long silver fighters that seemed immune to exhaustion. The rhythm of war had changed. Before a German pilot could measure a battle in minutes 10, to intercept 2, to engage 5, to return. Now the battles lasted hours, and the enemy stayed. The old rituals no longer worked. There was no clear beginning, no safe ending. The air war had become a continuous storm stretching from the Channel to the Danube. Every new dawn brought more contrails, more smoke, and fewer reasons to believe the Reich still ruled its own sky. At first, the command tried to explain the defeats as chance, bad weather, poor coordination. But the reports spoke for themselves. Loss rates were climbing beyond recovery: 3 fighters lost for every bomber destroyed, then 5, then more. The pilots still flying were boys now, some with barely 40 hours of training. They climbed into the cockpits, trembling with both fear and pride, trusting the math that had failed their teachers. Keller saw them arrive by truck faces too young for the hardness in their eyes. They listened to his instructions, nodded, and took off into the haze. By evening, they half would not return. He stopped learning their names. The radio call signs were easier to forget. In one letter to his wife, he wrote, "We fight ghosts now. They come from every direction. I shoot and hit nothing but light." Above him, the Americans refined their own kind of rhythm. The P-51s no longer flew just as escorts. They had become predators. After guarding the bombers to the target, they swept ahead on their return journey, strafing airfields, rail yards, and convoys. They hunted trains like wolves, tearing through lines of freight cars carrying fuel and munitions. They dropped low over highways, engines roaring like thunderclaps, their 50-caliber guns ripping apart everything that moved. German soldiers on leave learned to dive for ditches at the sound of that distant whine. Mustangs, they whispered and ducked their heads. Even the countryside felt occupied, now the sky itself a territory conquered without ever being claimed. In April, the Luftwaffe tried one last act of defiance, a concentrated counterattack over central Germany. It was meant to be a statement, proof that the Reich could still strike back. Instead, it became a massacre. The P-51s met them at altitude, diving through their formations with surgical precision. The new gyro gun sights turned average pilots into marksmen, predicting the enemy's movement before it happened. Keller's squadron went up with 20 aircraft and came home with 8. He remembered the sky as a sheet of white streaked with burning planes falling like meteors. On the ground, someone said quietly, "They've stolen the air from us." He wanted to disagree, but couldn't. The reports from other groups were the same: fuel shortages, pilot shortages, morale collapsing. What had once been a proud brotherhood of hunters was now a collection of survivors counting the hours until the next raid. By summer, the numbers told the story better than any speech. Allied sorties over the Reich reached 1,600 a day. German production fell by half, transport systems shattered, and fuel depots burned faster than they could be rebuilt. For the first time, the Americans fought on their own terms, not by chance or courage, but by endurance. The war that had once favored boldness now rewarded patience. In a single month, the Luftwaffe lost nearly half its remaining operational fighters. Some pilots began to refuse takeoff orders, citing mechanical faults that did not exist. Others flew anyway, desperate to die in the air, rather than watch their world shrink from a hangar floor. Keller flew on, though he no longer believed in victory. He did it because flying was the only thing left that made sense. Each mission felt like reliving the same dream: gray sky, burning engines, the endless hum of oxygen through the mask. Across the channel, the mood could not have been more different. At airfields in England, pilots laughed, sang, and scribbled notes on the noses of their aircraft: Berlin Express, Sweet Arlene, Detroit, Miss. They had stopped thinking of themselves as protectors and started thinking of themselves as conquerors. The Mustangs had become symbols, proof that technology, discipline, and distance could crush the arrogance of any empire. In the mess tents, men compared fuel efficiency figures the way gamblers compared winnings. The data became their language: miles per gallon, sorties per day, kill ratios. For them, victory had a number, and the numbers all pointed in one direction. In one small room of the Luftwaffe's command headquarters, a weary colonel summarized it in a single sentence. "We are no longer an air force," he said. "We are a memory." The others nodded, but said nothing. Outside, the evening sky was streaked with white lines fading westward, the contrails of bombers and their escorts heading home. Keller stood on the runway, watching them disappear into the setting sun. He wondered what the men in those silver planes saw when they looked down, whether they felt triumph or just exhaustion. Somewhere deep down, he almost envied them. They had purpose. All he had was the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same, only worse. And yet, amid the ruins and the smoke, he still climbed into his aircraft when ordered. Habit, not hope, carried him aloft. Each flight began the same way: the hiss of oxygen, the rattle of the canopy, the engine's vibration through the seat. Above the clouds, the world was silent again, indifferent to victory or defeat. From that height, even the fire over Berlin looked small. For a few seconds, he could almost pretend it was still 1940, when the sky felt infinite and the enemy was far away. But then a shadow passed over his wing, a glint of metal sliding effortlessly beside him, another Mustang escorting another formation to another target. Keller didn't reach for his gun. He just watched it go, the sound fading into the thin air. By dusk, the smoke of burning fuel hung over every horizon. The war that had begun with laughter and precision now moved with inertia, one side running out of machines, the other running out of pity. Above it all, the Mustangs roamed freely, their long wings slicing through the dying light, symbols of a new kind of warfare where reach meant power and endurance meant victory. The hunters had become the hunted, and the sky itself no longer belonged to those who believed in invincibility, but to those who had learned how to stay. Factories in America no longer slept. The hum of industry rolled through the night like an unending tide: lathes, spinning welders, sparking conveyor belts carrying wings, engines, and dreams toward the war across the ocean. The Mustang was no longer just a fighter. It was a production rhythm, a living heartbeat of a nation that understood war was not only fought by men, but by machines and by the hands that built them. In Detroit, Dallas, and Inglewood, rows of workers, women in coveralls, teenagers fresh from school, men too old for combat, moved with precision down assembly lines. They built Merlins by the thousands, every bolt torqued to the same tension, every cylinder checked twice. Packard's engine plant alone produced one every 28 minutes. The numbers became poetry. 200 horsepower, 200 miles of range, 12 hours from factory to runway. It wasn't glamour. It was logistics, and logistics was victory. Each night, freight trains loaded with crated engines rattled through the darkness toward eastern ports. Ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys, holds packed with metal that would soon breathe fire over Europe. The system was vast, almost biological in its efficiency, a circulatory network of steel fuel and people. At every node, someone worked through exhaustion, because somewhere above the clouds, a pilot would need that engine, that hose, that single bullet. On the receiving end, in the airfields of England, the choreography continued. Maintenance crews could replace an entire engine in 4 hours. Ground gunners reharmonized 50-caliber machine guns in 90 minutes. Tire changes, fuel top-offs, reloading, all done by routine so seamless it bordered on ritual. Lose 10 Mustangs on Monday, replace 15 by Friday. The war had become an equation of endurance, and America's numbers didn't run out. In Germany, the math reversed. Fuel depots burned nightly under Allied bombs, and supply lines fractured like glass under the weight of 1,000 sorties. Aircraft sat idle for lack of gasoline, and pilots waited for orders that would never come. The Reich's industrial web, once the envy of Europe, was bleeding from every artery. Trains no longer arrived. Tracks twisted in the heat of incendiary raids. Factories relocated underground into caves, into forests, anywhere flak couldn't reach. But secrecy could not substitute for output. Without oil, without transport, even the best designs turned to scrap. By mid-1944, nearly half the Luftwaffe's planes never left the ground. Mechanics scavenged parts from wrecks. Engines were swapped between squadrons like organs in a dying body. The pilots who did fly found themselves climbing into machines built faster than they could be taught to use them. The difference wasn't only in production, it was in training the invisible engine of victory. In the United States, flight schools ran day and night. Young men lined up to learn the complex choreography of air combat. Instructors drilled them in fuel management, gunnery formation, discipline, and radio brevity. Fly the numbers, they were told. It wasn't poetry, but it saved lives. Each graduate logged more than 240 flight hours before crossing the Atlantic, their hands already molded to the throttle, their instincts sharpened by repetition. When they met the enemy, they fought as a system, interchangeable, coordinated, confident. Across the ocean, the Luftwaffe's training fields lay silent. The fuel that once filled their tanks now burned in the engines of Allied bombers. Cadets went up with 50 hours at best, some with barely 20. They learned under fire, and they died before mastering the lesson. Keller could see it in their faces when they arrived, boys really, who saluted too stiffly and spoke too fast, eager to prove something that no longer mattered. He watched one, a blonde kid with a pilot's badge, still polished from graduation, struggle to start his plane on the first try. The engine coughed, then caught, and the boy looked up through the canopy with a grin that said he still believed. Keller turned away. Belief had become dangerous. The factories in Germany still built fighters, the sleek FW-190Ds, the promising Me-262 jets, but they were answers to questions already obsolete. The Americans didn't win by invention. They won by continuation. Every machine lost was replaced before it mattered. Every pilot killed had another waiting. The Luftwaffe still had engineers, still had courage, but it had run out of time. By the winter of 1944, the difference could be measured in noise. Over English airfields, the sound was constant, the buzz of engines being tested, the hiss of fuel lines, the steady hum of readiness. Over German bases, there was silence broken only by the occasional startup that ended in a sputtering cough. Keller once listened to his own engine turning over in the pre-dawn dark and realized that the hum itself was history being written. Somewhere across the channel, an American pilot was hearing the same sound, but for him it meant continuity, not collapse. The war had turned into a contest of endurance, and one side had built a machine to last forever. The other had built only legends. The Mustang was proof that the real miracle of the war was not a weapon, but a process, the coordination of millions working toward a single end. It was an assembly line stretched across oceans, synchronized to a rhythm no empire could match. The United States didn't just manufacture planes, it manufactured momentum. Keller would never see it, but in distant factories, women kept turning wrenches under posters that said, "The man who needs this is fighting now." The truth was simpler: the man who had it would live. By the time the snow began to fall over Berlin, the Luftwaffe's last sorties had turned from defense to ritual, brief flickers of defiance against an enemy who no longer needed to prove he could reach them. The Americans had built not only a fighter, but a System 1 that could lose 10 and return 21 that replaced belief with certainty. And somewhere in the endless hum of engines across the Atlantic, the outcome of the war had already been decided. By the spring of 1945, the sky above Germany no longer belonged to anyone but the wind. The contrails that once traced battle lines now drifted aimlessly, marking not struggle but exhaustion. The Luftwaffe still flew in name, in memory, in fragments, but what remained was little more than reflex. Airfields were craters. Hangars were twisted skeletons of steel. The pilots who had survived this long moved like ghosts through the wreckage of their own legend. Hans Keller no longer expected victory. He climbed into his plane each morning, not out of duty, but because silence on the ground was worse than noise in the sky. Above 10,000 feet, the world still made sense: wind speed, oxygen, and the faint rattle of the canopy that had once been the soundtrack of power. Now it was the echo of an empire dying one breath at a time. The missions had become symbolic gestures, desperate flights against bombers that never even noticed them. The Americans came in waves, 300, 600, sometimes 1,000 at once, their silver bellies glinting in the sun. The P-51s swept ahead of them, cutting through the high air like surgeons. The precision was chilling. Keller could only watch as his country's final defenses disintegrated beneath that relentless machine of endurance. Fuel was gone, training fields silent, and the few remaining aces fought without illusion. In their letters home, when mail even moved, they wrote about the sky as if it were a memory, something once owned but now leased by fate. Keller wrote none at all. Words seemed insufficient against the steady hum of inevitability. In April, he flew his last mission. The order was to intercept a formation near the Elbe. There were only 3 aircraft left in his Gruppe, all patched together from scavenged parts. The takeoff was uneven, the ground shaking from artillery somewhere nearby. When he climbed above the smoke, he saw them, the endless stream of bombers heading east. The same line he had seen a year before, but thicker now, slower, heavier, and utterly unopposed. He didn't even try to engage. The others made one pass, fired a few shells, then broke away. Keller leveled out and just watched. The bombers seemed to move without effort, the escorts circling them like a halo. He remembered the first time he'd seen those Mustangs, the shock, the disbelief, the fury, and realized how far that moment had carried him. The noise of his engine sounded old, almost human in its exhaustion. He turned west, flying over forests still scarred from last year's raids. When he landed, no one came to meet him. The war had already moved on. When the surrender came, the silence was almost merciful. The surviving German pilots gathered what was left of their aircraft, lined them up along the edge of the airfield, and waited. Some smashed their pistols. Others stared at their hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The Americans arrived a week later, ground crews, engineers, intelligence officers. Keller watched from a distance as they examined the wrecks, taking notes, photographing the fragments of machines that had once ruled Europe's air. He expected arrogance, but saw only curiosity. The younger Americans treated the ruined F-90s with a kind of respect, touching the scorched metal the way one touches history. One of them walked past Keller, unaware of who he was, and said to his companion, "Hard to believe they almost beat us once." Keller wanted to answer, "We never really beat you either. We just ran out of time." But he said nothing. In the months that followed, the war dissolved into memory and paperwork. Keller was sent home to a city that barely existed. Its skyline flattened, its silence heavier than flak. He found work in a repair yard fixing bicycles, the irony not lost on him. Sometimes he would look up when he heard an engine overhead, a reflex that never quite faded. The skies were filled again, but this time with American transports carrying food and coal instead of bombs. The same machines that had destroyed Germany were now feeding it. He watched them glide across the horizon and understood something that had eluded him all through the war. Power wasn't just destruction, it was continuity. The Americans had built not only airplanes, but a system that could keep them aloft long after victory no longer required them. Across the ocean, the legacy of that system took shape in manuals, blueprints, and doctrines. Engineers who had built Mustangs went on to design Sabres, Phantoms, and Eagles, all of them descendants of that one machine that had rewritten the meaning of distance. The phrase long-range escort became a principle of air power. The lesson was simple, brutal, and permanent. Endurance beats brilliance. Scale beats courage. Museums began to collect the relics of that truth, B-17s restored to shine beneath hangar lights, P-51s parked beside them with their red noses gleaming. Visitors walked through the aisles, tracing their fingers across the rivets, reading plaques that turned sweat and death into history. A docent once told a group of schoolchildren, "This small plane protected that big one." A boy asked, "Did it win the war?" The man smiled and said, "It made it possible to end one." Years later, when Keller was an old man walking through a park in what had once been East Germany, he heard a familiar sound in the sky, a low, rhythmic hum, gentle yet certain. He looked up and saw a P-51 flying in formation with a modern jet during an air show, the past escorting the future. The sight brought no bitterness, only understanding. The same hum of the oxygen mask, the same rattle of the canopy echoes of an age when belief and machinery collided in the clouds. For the men who had flown, then it was not about good or evil anymore. It was about endurance, about what survives after the fire burns out. The law of the sky had revealed itself at last. In the end, it belongs not to those who rise fastest, but to those who can stay. And as the Mustang faded into the distance, its contrail thin and white against the blue, Keller thought of that first day over Berlin, the day the laughter stopped and the sky changed sides. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint hiss of air through his teeth, the ghost of oxygen that once carried him higher than fear could reach. The sound was soft now, almost peaceful. Above him the wind carried a whisper that might have been memory or forgiveness. Either way, it was the same message written across every horizon. The war had ever touched, the sound of engines that refused to die, and the silence that follows when history finally runs out of fuel.